Great. Well, welcome to everyone. We are so glad that you are here with us today. I'm just making sure that we are indeed recording. Yes, we are. Welcome to the Wednesday webinar for May. The topic today is financial aid appeals. I'm Mila Tappan from the Finance Authority of Maine, and with me today is Maria McDougall. And Maria is going to be watching the questions come in and let me know if there are any issues, and we're going to stop periodically and answer some questions. So thank you, Maria, for being here. It's great to see you. And we're so glad that all of you could join us. We had a different topic prepared for May originally. In the summer, we usually will project out what our calendar of events is going to be for the year. And we had a different topic, but in light of COVID-19, we did change it. We changed it for April, and then we've changed it again for May because we really want to be sure that we're hopefully providing the information that all of you need. We are going to talk about appeals. We are going to talk about appeals in light of COVID-19, but in reality, we're going to talk about appeals even if COVID hadn't happened. And financial aid appeals are something that we talk about periodically, and it seemed like a really good time to focus on it, both in light, again, of the current circumstances, but just in general, knowing that appeals are possible and appropriate. So before we actually dive into the content, this is being recorded. So if for some reason you need to leave early or something, know that it's recorded. And if you want to check out the rest of it or watch it again, that will be possible. If you have questions, would you please ask them in the Q&A section? And what will happen is, again, Maria is going to be monitoring them. We'll answer as many of them as we can during the presentation. But if we are not able to get to all of the questions, or in some cases, questions are sometimes very specific, then I'll follow up in writing afterwards, either to the whole group or, again, very specific, maybe to the individual, or I will to the individual who asked the question. Okay? So with that, let's get started. So we're going to start by laying the foundation, kind of talking about appeals in general, and kind of the concept behind appeals and why they're so important. We're going to talk about appeal scenarios. We're actually going to go through all the different types of appeals that a family or a student may want to do. We're going to talk about the timing, the process, and then at the end, we're going to talk a little bit about, with COVID happening, kind of what should we anticipate is going to be, what are going to be issues going forward in the future. So I think before we even get started, one of the things that we really always want to convey is that students can and should appeal when it's appropriate. One of the things that I think this has brought to light is there are a lot of people who don't realize that you can appeal your financial aid. We want people to appeal their financial aid. The financial aid offices want people to appeal their financial aid when it's appropriate and when things have changed. And so we're going to go through all of those steps today, but that's one of the biggest underlying messages. Even though we say that whenever we do financial aid nights, I think people are hesitant sometimes to appeal. None of us like to ask for more money. I will do these presentations and I'll say how important it is to appeal, and I didn't appeal one time with one of my kids, and it was hard. You know, it's just, none of us want to do them, but they're really, really, really important. And oftentimes they can generate more financial aid, and that's what it's all about. So we're going to go through those scenarios today. But even after COVID has come and gone, please keep in mind that appeals are something that we want students and families to think about and to be sure they pursue when it's appropriate. So one of the things that makes appeals so necessary is that the Fafsa represents a snapshot in time. So it's literally, that's why I put the little camera there, because it's literally a snapshot in time. On the income side, it's a snapshot of a designated year. So for students who are doing the 2021 FAFSA, which is kind of the year we're in right now, so students have been doing the 2021 FAFSA since October 1st, that required 2018 income information. So I know some financial aid people are on the phone, are on the line with us today as well. And so a couple of years ago, we made the switch to the FAFSA becoming available in October. And one of the other things that it did is it started using what we refer to in the financial aid world as prior year income. So whenever you're looking at a FAFSA and the year of the FAFSA, you know, the income is going to be based on 2 years prior. So 2021, it's the 2018 income information that is required. That absolutely is the income that has to be used when completing that FAFSA. But obviously, sometimes that's going to change. And so that's where an appeal comes into play. Other things like marital status and assets are also a snapshot, but they're reflective of the day that the FAFSA is filed. Okay, so income is based on that designated year, that prior year. Marital status, assets, and everything else is based on that snapshot in time being the day that that FAFSA is being completed and signed and submitted. That's the day that those pieces of information are going to reflect. So another thing, just before we get started, just to hopefully make things a little less confusing, is that I'm going to use the term appeal for today, all the way through, hopefully consistently, I'm going to use the term appeal. But you might also hear different terms associated with doing an appeal. The most common is something called professional judgment, or PJ. So as you know, financial aid is filled with acronyms. And so in the financial aid world, we often refer to this as PJ, because there's literally language that's in the Higher Education Act that allows financial aid administrators to make adjustments after the FAFSA has been filed. And that's referred to as exercising professional judgment. So you might hear a school say, oh, you want to do a PJ. That's what they mean by that. They mean that the student is asking for the school to do a review and have the school administrator, the financial aid administrator, use their professional judgment to make a determination if certain adjustments can be made. Sometimes appeals are also referred to as special circumstances. Special circumstances because circumstances have changed. There's something special or different that's happened. So that's a term that you will hear sometimes used in association with appeals. I personally tend to think of special circumstances having to do more with dependency status when the FAFSA is being filed, that sometimes we have dependent students who have special circumstances that can be considered independent, but you will still hear special circumstances sometimes associated with the appeal process. So that's kind of the terminology piece I wanted to start with. The other thing is I'm going to refer to students appealing their financial aid, but the reality is when parent information has changed, when income information has changed, oftentimes the parent is going to be who's taking the lead. So even though I'm saying the student should contact the financial aid office, if it's parent information that has changed, parents can also contact the financial aid office and have that discussion. Now, there is something called FERPA. So for a financial aid officer to speak with a parent, a release is going to have to be signed. So just be sure, I think it's good practice, generally speaking, to always have the parent have the ability to talk with the financial aid office and have the student sign that FERPA release. It's one of the things that with my kids, you know, believe me, they just assumed I talked about some of these things rather than them having to do it. But financial aid offices are limited as to what they can talk about without that. So be sure that that's in place as well. And then today, I'm also really going to focus on dependent students. But just because I'm focusing on dependent students doesn't mean independent students can't do appeals as well. They absolutely can. I just think that when we talk about most of the appeals that are taking place, they're often for dependent students, although we have lots of independent students who might be returning to school. So if that's the case, they can certainly do these sorts of appeals as well. Okay? So that's kind of the foundation piece. And now let's go on and talk about the actual appeal scenarios. So I'm going to go over 5 different scenarios where an appeal would be appropriate. So here you've got them listed. I'm just going to run through them really quickly. And then what we're going to do is we're going to focus in on each one of these scenarios. So scenario A is when the student, on the day the FAFSA is being filed, people already know that the information is no longer reflective of their current situation. Scenario B, the FAFSA gets filed and then things change. And so then there's the situation where we want to do an appeal. There are also things that aren't on the appeal, on the FAFSA at all. So we're going to talk about what do you do about sometimes there's something really impacting the family's ability to pay for college, but there's nowhere to put that on the FAFSA. So that's another scenario. A fourth scenario is when there's no change in circumstances, the student just needs more aid. So that can happen as well. And then scenario E is when the student might have things in their cost of attendance, that budget that the school puts together, tuition fees, room, board, book supplies, travel, miscellaneous, that are higher than what the school is using. And the student needs to communicate that and see if any adjustments are appropriate. Okay, so those are kind of the 5 overview scenarios. So let's dig into each of them a little bit more and how they get handled. So on the day that the FAFSA is filed, the income information is already different and does not reflect the current situation. So we're going to have this happen a lot with this upcoming fall. So on October 1st, the 21-22 FAFSA is going to become available. it is going to require that 2019 income information be used. We already know that for many families, that 2019 income is not going to be reflective of their financial income when they file their FAFSA in 21-22. So how does that situation get dealt with? So what's going to happen is the FAFSA has to be submitted with the required information. So even though I'm talking to a family today that might say, you know, why would I be using 2019? It's not accurate anymore. It is just the way that the process is set up, and it is just the way that we have to deal with these sorts of situations. So the families will submit the FAFSA using that 2019 income information. The student will then follow up with the financial aid office, let them know that things have changed. We're going to go into more detail in just a little bit on some of these specifics. But if the appeal is approved, the financial aid office will make the adjustment. Okay, the student's not going to do anything to their FAFSA, but if the financial aid office says, yes, we need to make an adjustment, they will take care of adjusting the information on the FAFSA. In scenario B, the FAFSA has been filed, and then some information might change. So what we're having happen right now is we have all of these students out there who have already filed the 2021 FAFSA. That's the FAFSA that's required for the upcoming academic year. So they filed their FAFSA back in January, let's say. And now it's May, and maybe a parent has had a reduction in hours or has lost their job completely. So in this scenario, the student does not go in and do anything to their FAFSA. What they do instead is they follow up with the financial aid office, okay? Other things can change as well, because remember we talked about the FAFSA being a snapshot, and the fact that on the day the FAFSA is filed, that is what marital status is based on. So let's just say parents are married on the day the FAFSA is filed, but then 6 months later, the parents get divorced or separated. That is a change that may need to be looked at. If there's only one parent providing income at this point to the student, that may have changed the dynamic dramatically. Or unfortunately, we always have some parents who pass away during the year. And so that situation needs to be dealt with. Now, just as a very quick aside, asset information never gets updated. So I heard this funny story about a student who the school was a little bit frustrated with, because every time the student made a purchase, she went into the FAFSA and she adjusted her income, her asset information. So, you know, she'd go in and she'd reduce it down from 1,500 to 1,200 or to 1,100 or whatever. And every time she made an update, the school got a new record, a new, what we call an ICER, a new, file for that student. And that is not something that you do. Asset information does not get updated. That is going to be what it is, stay as a snapshot all the way through, okay? But as we just talked about, there are going to be things like income that's going to change sometimes after the FAFSA is filed. Marital status, parents might get divorced or separated, or a parent might pass away. If any of these happen, the student does not go back into their FAFSA. We never want the student to go back into their FAFSA and make an adjustment. Instead, they need to contact the financial aid office, let them know about their situation, and then if it's appropriate, the financial aid office will go back into the FAFSA and make an adjustment. One of the things that we talk about a lot in the financial aid world, or when we're working with students who are completing FAFSAs, is the difference between a correction and an update. So we absolutely will say to students, oops, you made a mistake on the FAFSA. You do need to go in and correct it. So if a student makes a mistake when they first file their FAFSA, yes, we absolutely do want them to go back in and correct a mistake. But we do not want them to go in and update information if that information changes, okay? So corrections versus updates are thought of very differently in the financial aid world. So when the student has an update because things have changed, they are not going to go back into their FAFSA. They're not going to make any adjustments. Instead, they're going to contact the financial aid office and see if the financial aid office thinks it's appropriate to make a change. This is all building towards something, everybody. So then we have scenario C. And this is when there are items that are not on the FAFSA in impacting the family's ability to pay for school. So one of the things that when I'm doing a financial aid night, I will say to people, think about what information, as you're filling out the FAFSA, think about the information that's on the FAFSA. That is all the financial aid office knows about you. That's it. They don't have any additional information. If your student wrote maybe an admissions essay and they talked about something going on in their family, the financial aid office is likely not going to even know about that. So all they typically know about is what's on the FAFSA. So if there's anything impacting the ability of the family to pay for school, they need to let the school know that separately, because that's the only way the school is going to find that out. So what are some examples of this? Some examples would be out-of-pocket medical expenses that are particularly high. You know, the formula builds in the fact that we do have medical expenses, but I'm talking about when they're higher than kind of what is average or typical. If we have a situation where parents are paying back education loans, so it might be that parents are paying back their own loans, or parents are paying for maybe doing a parent loan repayment for a student that they had, a child that they had that's older and may already be in school or have graduated from school, but parents are making educational loan payments. There's nowhere to put that on the FAFSA. Parents themselves may be enrolled in college. One of the specific things when you fill out a FAFSA and you look at the number in college is you are not supposed to list a parent as being enrolled in college, even if they are. Instead, you have to deal with that by going back to the financial aid office and having a conversation about that. And the reason that's the case is that's a change that occurred, you know, sometime in the last, 25, 30 years that I've been in financial aid, probably about midway through, is because sometimes when parents are in college, someone else, maybe their employer, is paying for their expenses. So the impact of having a parent in college financially might be very different than having another child in college. So schools just want the opportunity to take a look at that. But if that's the scenario and parents are paying for some of their own schooling out of pocket, they want to be sure they follow up with the financial aid office. So the student or parent will let the financial aid office know about these. And if the appeal is approved, the financial aid office will make an adjustment to the FAFSA. So what do all three of these first scenarios have in common? In all of these cases, the student does not do anything. They don't touch their FAFSA, but what they do instead is they reach out to the financial aid office to discuss the situation, okay? So students are never gonna update their FAFSA. They're gonna go to the financial aid office, and the financial aid office, once they've gathered the appropriate information and had the conversation, will determine if an update can and should be made. So I want to go a little deeper into these first three scenarios, and then we'll take care of the last two. So in these first three scenarios, information changed after the FAFSA was filed, information changed before the FAFSA was filed, but 19 information had to be used for a given year, or information that's not on the FAFSA at all. What happens when you're having a conversation with a financial aid office, and I was in a financial aid office for 16 years, so I'm doing a lot of this based on that. And so, I think it's pretty much the same way, and continue to talk with financial aid offices about that. But what I would be doing when I was sitting with a student and having the conversation is I'm trying to think in my head, okay, what is their circumstance? What has changed? And what I'm trying to do is identify a data element that I need to adjust. So it's not typically that you just go in and say, hey, I just want more money. We'll get to that in a moment if that's the case. But most of the time, what the school is needing to do is they're needing to create additional eligibility, or to create a situation where the student becomes eligible for a certain type of aid. And how they do that is by actually adjusting an item that's on the FAFSA. The items that typically get adjusted: income, taxes paid, and or household size. Because the ultimate goal in a financial aid office is to try to reduce that expected family contribution. So when a student files a FAFSA, we know that the end result of that is an expected family contribution. What the goal is, oftentimes with the vast majority of these appeals, and all the ones we've talked about so far, is that we're trying to get that EFC decreased. And the reason that we're trying to do that is to create additional eligibility. So typical data elements that might be adjusted is, for example, and I know I'm going into the weeds a little bit here, but I think for all of you, the vast majority of you are working with students on a regular basis. So I think kind of knowing what happens when they go to the financial aid office can help guide them as to what information they need to provide and what information they might want to be sure that they're conveying. So in the case of there being a job loss, so if I'm sitting in my financial aid office and a student comes in, parents lost their job, what I'm thinking about, okay, their income has been changed and their taxes paid have been changed. So literally, as a financial aid person, I would go in and I would adjust in their FAFSA the income and the taxes paid, and hopefully reduce the EFC. If the parents have divorced, then what I might be doing instead is saying, okay, which parent is going to become the parent for the purposes of the FAFSA? Which parent is the student going to be living with from this point forward? I'm going to take out the other parent's income information. I'm going to adjust the taxes, and I'm going to adjust the household size. Typically, when I've adjusted parents' income from 2 parents to 1, that's going to create more eligibility. So that behind the scenes is what the financial aid office is going to do. And then in the scenario where there are significant non-discretionary expenses, what I would do, for example, is I would say, okay, so what are those expenses and how can I take this into account? So I'm thinking about a scenario one time where I had a student and her sibling was very sick. Her sibling had cancer. It was a really, really sad set of circumstances. It ended up being okay, but at the time it was really difficult. And the reality was the family had medical insurance. And so most of their medical expenses were paid for. They did have some out of pocket, but that wasn't what was making it difficult. What was making it difficult was that they were making regular trips to Boston. So they were going to Boston on a monthly basis, and they lived up in Aroostook County. So Aroostook County to Boston's a long drive with a lot of gas. They were typically spending a night or 2 in a hotel. They were additionally, having to buy food because they had to eat in some way. So one of the things that we were able to do was to take a look at all of those expenses. And what I was doing in my head is saying to myself, okay, they might have an adjusted gross income of $60,000, but there's $5,000, and it would be documented. But let's just say in this scenario, there are $5,000 of expenses that were associated with this family making all of these trips and having all of these medical expenses. There was no way in which that family could contribute as much to college as it might look on paper, because once you took into account these non-discretionary expenses, in reality, they didn't have $60,000. Maybe they had more like 55 once I reduced that AGI down. Again, this is why it's considered professional judgment, because as a financial aid person at that time, I could use my discretion to say, okay, I see what the income looks like on paper, but when I know more about the family and what's going on with the family, I know that number is not reflective of what they actually have available to help pay for college. So I'm going to go in, I'm going to do a data element adjustment, and I'm going to take that AGI and I'm going to take it from 60,000 down to 55,000. So that's an example of what a financial aid office might do in that situation. The whole point of all of these data point adjustments is to see if we can get that EFC reduced. When we reduce an EFC, that expected family contribution, there are 2 primary things that happen. The biggest, I think, and where most schools are going to want to do an appeal, is when doing the appeal and reducing the EFC makes the student eligible for some or more Pell Grant or the main state grant. And the reason is those programs are based directly on the EFC. So, for example, I'm going to look at my notes here because I don't have this number committed to memory, but for the 2021 academic year, a student who's full-time is eligible for a Pell Grant if they have an EFC below $5,711, okay? So let's just say I'm working with a student and their EFC is $6,500. And the parent has experienced a job loss or a reduction in hours or was furloughed and didn't get, unemployment or something like that. If I go in and I adjust that income, the hope is that that EFC drops down below that 5711, and then the student becomes eligible for a Pell Grant. Schools will do these sorts of appeals because, we want to do those sorts of appeals, but also because the money's coming directly from the federal government. So even schools who have very limited resources want to do this sort of an appeal because if they can make the student eligible for Pell or eligible for more Pell, that's a win-win for everyone. Everyone's going to be happy about that scenario. So let's just say, I have a scenario here where the student's got a 5,100 Pell, 5,100 EFC. So that student would have been eligible in this case for, about $1,295 in a Pell Grant. But I get their EFC down by adjusting as appropriate down to $1,400. They become eligible for almost a $5,000 Pell Grant. And again, that money is going to come directly from the federal government. Pell is basically an entitlement program that's driven specifically by the EFC. So anytime a school can get that EFC down, the hope is that that is going to translate into more Pell Grant for that particular student. Same with the Maine State Grant. It's a little bit more black and white, but it is also based on the EFC. So getting the student into that eligible range will create more money for that student. So that's what the vast majority of appeals financial aid offices are trying to do. Reducing the EFC, though, also creates more need. So when we're talking about financial aid, the basic formula that all schools use is they say, what does it cost to go here? And every school's cost of attendance made up of tuition, fees, room, board, book supplies, travel, and miscellaneous. Every school's expenses are going to be different, but they all have a cost of attendance. They subtract the family's EFC, and that tells you how much need an individual student has. Well, if that EFC is decreased, the student has more need. So that's a good thing. And then if the school has money, they will hopefully be able to give the student more of that appeal aid. Now, when you have students who are attending schools, different schools do things in different ways. So even at my time at Orono, we had some years where we specifically set aside money to deal with appeals. And then we had other years where money was just so tight. So there was no appeal money set aside. The only thing we were able to do is hopefully make students eligible for more Pell Grant or Maine State Grant. But then some years when funding was a little bit more flexible, we actually had, a bucket of money that when a student came in needing an appeal, we could tap into that. And by creating more need, then we were able to award some of those funds, okay? Now, one of the things that in the financial aid office, we would often, if we had especially people answering the phones, maybe some of our newer student workers or something, one of the things we always wanted to say to them right up front is, if a student is calling about doing an appeal because dad lost his job, if there is an EFC of 0, there is no sense in pursuing this type of an appeal. We're going to talk about what they do want to do, but if a financial aid officer is sitting there and they're talking to you on the phone and the student has a 0 EFC, it can't be any lower than 0. They're already getting their max Pell. They're already getting their max Maine State Grant. You could go in and adjust the AGI and reduce it down, but they can't go lower than 0. So sometimes what we have happen is that students will feel like the financial aid office maybe didn't hear them or didn't understand their scenario. And instead, it's all about making sure that the student understands what they want to be asking for. So in this case, doing all this, going through updating the income is not going to get the student anywhere. So those of you who are working with a lot of students right now, and their EFC is already 0 and their parent has lost their job, doing an income appeal is not going to get them additional Pell or Maine State Grant. We still want them to talk to the financial aid office, but the financial aid office may well say to them, there's no sense in doing an income appeal. And it's not that they don't care, and it's not that something else might be able to be done, but 0 is the lowest that an EFC can go. So I hope that makes sense. And if that's not making sense, I will want to address it. So actually, why don't I take a quick break right here, Maria? I'm gonna do it a little bit quicker than I had intended. What are you seeing for questions? Did that come across in a way, or is it clear that I confused people?
No, I think you're great. I just love when we do these because we get such great questions from our professional colleagues and everything. They really want to get to the crux of the information. There's one I'll hold off on because I think we'll address it at the timing section.
Yep, we're going to talk about timing. Yep.
But we did have a question. If the financial aid office decides, makes the adjustment into the FAFSA, do other colleges see it?
Oh my God, that's a great question. That's a great question. We are going to touch on it a little bit later on down the road, but yes, the other colleges are going to see it. And here's the thing, then they can go make an adjustment themselves. So in a little bit down the road, right at the end, actually, we're going to talk about our high school seniors who will be applying to multiple schools when they're still trying to do appeals and kind of how that works. But yes, when a FAFSA gets adjusted, so if I'm, again, at Orono and I go in and I make an adjustment, I send that record back to the Federal Processing Center, back to Federal Student Aid, because I need them to know that we adjusted so they can get their Pell paid, right? Every school is going, that's on that FAFSA that the student listed, is also going to get that updated student aid report, or that ICER is what we called it in the financial aid office. Now, the one thing though is that it is marked as having a professional judgment having been done. So any of the other schools can see that yes, the information changed, and they can compare, kind of, okay, this is what the AGI was and here's what it is now. But they're going to know it was changed because of a professional judgment, and they will know which school did it. And ultimately, a student's only going to be at one school. So it's that final school that gets to make that final determination. But yes, they will see other adjustments that other schools make. Anything else right now, Maria, or should I?
Great. And another question was, what if the
I don't know if that's Maria or me. Maria is frozen at the moment, and I'm not sure if it's Maria or me. I am going to continue on based on the assumption. I'm going to look here real quick and see if I've got something coming in here. Hold on. Just going to look real quick. Okay, it's not me. Okay, I'm going to continue on. Yeah, I think Maria's going to come back to us in a moment. Okay, so we'll just move ahead on, and then we'll come back to those questions in a moment. All right, so now let's talk about scenario D. So scenario D is a case of that student that we just mentioned. Their EFC is already 0. So doing an adjustment because parent income has decreased isn't going to get them more Pell or more Main State grant, but the student still needs more aid. In another case, maybe just nothing has changed. Maybe it's just a case that the student, filled out their Fafsa, everything's the same, there's nothing more the school needs to know about, but the student just needs more money. That can occur, and that's because not all schools, for a matter of fact, most schools are not able to give a student 100% of their need. When we do that, cost of attendance minus EFC, oftentimes that need is not completely filled. Schools themselves, just like families, don't always have enough money to give students everything they need. So the end result is that the student might need more money. So in those cases where, again, 0 EFC and there are changes, or there are no changes and the student just needs more money, we do absolutely still want the student to talk to the school. But the big key is going to be whether or not the school has any funding set aside to deal with appeals. So a moment ago when I talked about the fact that, some schools will sometimes have money set aside, then that's where they would dip into their own resources and say, okay, here's what we can do for some additional money. So that's why we want those students to also follow up with the financial aid office. There is never any harm in asking. The worst case scenario is they don't have any more money. It's absolutely worth asking about, and we're going to talk about the timing of that specifically in just a moment. Okay. And then the last case scenario that I just wanted to talk about in a moment, for a moment, is what we would consider, a budget appeal. This is when a student has the cost of attendance. So the school has built their cost of attendance, but the student's reality is higher than what the school is using. So for example, many schools will assume that a full-time student is going to take 15 credit hours, maybe a semester. But this student, because maybe they're in their last year and they're trying to get done sooner rather than later, maybe they're going to take 18 credits a semester, or maybe they're going to take 21 credits a semester. And let's just say this is a school that charges on a per credit basis. So the student has a much higher cost than the average typical student. So the student can go to the school and say, hey, I'm taking these extra credits. Is there any additional aid to help me pay for those? Another example might be the cost of a computer. Many schools will recognize the cost of a computer, but it isn't automatically built into the student's cost of attendance or into the student's budget. So a student can go and ask the school to do that. Now, I will say for that expense, I don't know that schools are typically going to be able to dip into their appeal money to help fund that. But I do have another thought on that I'm going to come back to. Same with room and board expenses. The student might be in a situation where, maybe their living situation is such that, that it's more expensive. Maybe the student lives in a single, and maybe some schools will fund that. Or maybe they live in one building on campus that's more expensive than another, and maybe the school will take that into account. These are going to be very discretionary things that schools might look at differently. One thing that a school can never take into account, though, is the cost of a car payment. So even though the school does have a line for travel expenses, and a school can take into account, insurance, they can take into account car repairs, they can take into account gas, what they cannot take into account is the actual car payment. It's one of the few things that's actually forbidden. Schools cannot use their professional judgment to make an adjustment to take into account a student having a car payment. So you want the student to talk to the school about these things. Again, if the school has some appeal money, maybe they can help with them. These things are probably less likely to result in additional aid, but it so depends on the school. It really just depends on whether the school has additional funding to be able to help the student. Where these types of appeals, though, are most important is when there might be an overaward. So I know in a lot of our other presentations, we talk about the fact that students sometimes will get funding from outside sources. They'll get a scholarship or something, and we don't want the student to miss out on that aid. We want them to be able to get that scholarship and keep all of the other aid that they had to start with. So one of the ways that a school might be able to work with a student, and this is why we want the student to call the school, is say the student did buy a laptop, okay? The school may not have a laptop in the school's cost of attendance for that student. The school might not be willing to fund the purchase of a laptop, but maybe they will build it into the student's cost of attendance, because again, what's gonna happen is if the cost of attendance goes up, the EFC stays the same, the student has more need and can have more financial aid, allowing them to keep that scholarship potentially, as well as all of the original aid that the school had offered them. So these types of appeals don't typically generate more financial aid, more new financial aid, but oftentimes are appeals that we want to be done so that students can keep all of the aid that they've been awarded from those variety of sources. Okay, I hope that made sense.
So can I jump back in with some questions?
Yes, absolutely,
okay.
Please.
Sorry about my technical difficulties. I've got multiple people in the house using internet, and we just switched or upgraded our service. So I'm hopefully not going to disappear again now. We had a question. What if the data that has changed is income, which leads to housing instability and homelessness? Does that change dependency?
Well, and I want to say that sometimes we're going to have cases that are going to get very in the weeds. So probably talking to the financial aid office, not probably talking to the financial aid office is always the best way to go. But one thing that I would say is that when it comes to homelessness, one of the definitions that is within the homelessness definition is that a student has to be unaccompanied. So if I had a student who was living, with their parents, they filled out the Fafsa, or even if they hadn't filled out the Fafsa yet, parents lose their jobs, parents become homeless. If that student is still living with their parents, if they're still accompanied by their parents, they actually don't meet the homeless criteria. In order to meet the homeless criteria, the student has to be unaccompanied. So in that specific case, that actually would not make the student independent, okay? But it's because the student is still, I'm using the assumption that the student is still with their parents, so not unaccompanied. But we could definitely go down a whole rabbit hole on those sorts of scenarios, and I'm happy to at the end if we still have time left, okay? So do you think that's okay for now, Maria, and we can?
Yes, I think that we've got others that I think will fit at other times.
Okay, all right. So I will move ahead and I want to talk about timing. So I'm going to kind of reset. Let's go back and talk about our 5 scenarios and the timing associated with when appeals want to be done. And as important, when I think you might expect the financial aid office to be able to do it, some factors that they're trying to take into effect. And I hope that my financial aid friends on the phone, if I'm saying anything that you are just, really losing your mind over, please let me know because I really want to demonstrate and reflect what you're all doing. So if I've gotten something terribly wrong, let me know, but I hope not. So in the scenario where when the student fills out the FAFSA, they already know the information is different. We want them to contact the financial aid office as soon as possible. Now, one thing that we will often say is we talk a lot about getting the FAFSA completed in October or November, like just get your FAFSA done, just get your FAFSA done. But then we also say, then you kind of do hurry up and wait, right? Because a financial aid office is not ready to deal with the upcoming year in October or November typically. So we want the family to reach out to the school because we want to be sure that the school knows about their scenario, but the school may not be ready to deal with the appeal for a bit. When I was at Orono, and my Orono friends can correct me if they've changed their policy, we typically, except for maybe some very extreme circumstances, we wanted to get everyone's initial award out first. We wanted to use whatever year, 2019, for example, income, and we wanted to get the awards all out there, and then we would deal with appeals. Now, I'm not saying every school is that way, which is, again, why we want students to reach out to the schools and find out for sure. But if you hear from a school, nope, we're going to go ahead, we're going to do the initial appeals first, and then the initial awards first, and then we're going to do appeals. That is, I think, consistently how a lot of schools deal with this. And the reason that they do that is that sometimes, even with all of the circumstances not being reflected, sometimes the financial aid is enough. So they kind of want to get everything out there first, and timeliness has something to do with it as well. And then they'll come back and deal with appeals, which of course are going to take them much longer. So that is the timing. Contact the school, but don't be surprised if they're not ready to deal with it yet. Scenario B is when the change occurs after the FAFSA has been filed, sometime during the year, maybe spring before they ever go to school, or maybe it's midway through their school year. They want to follow up with the school as soon as possible. Now, one of the things that does happen in a financial aid office, and this is going to happen with the COVID scenario now, is it's really difficult to do an appeal when everything is so up in the air. So sometimes there are occasions where a school will say, okay, we recognize that your parent has lost their job. We care that your parent has lost their job. We definitely want to do an appeal and to take a look at that. But we might need to hold off a little bit until things kind of settle, until we have a sense of whether it's permanent or whether it's temporary, whether the family member is going to be able to get unemployment or not. So reach out to the school as soon as possible, but there might be occasions where they say, we just aren't quite ready to do this appeal yet. We need a little more time and a little bit more information. When it comes to that scenario C, which is when there are items that are not on the FAFSA that they want to share with the school, they want to do that as soon as possible. And one of the things that I didn't mention earlier, but as I was writing my notes to get ready for today and putting the presentation together, I remembered this case when again, reflecting back on my Orono time a lot today, but I remember being in the phone room and a parent called and they were not happy with us at all because they wanted to do an appeal. And the reason that they wanted to do an appeal was because the student's older sibling was getting married. And they were just, I was almost going to say a bad word, they were just blank with us because we would not take into account that they were spending $20,000 on their other student's wedding. And how dare us not reflect that, and do an appeal to adjust that. So when I was talking a bit ago about non-discretionary expenses, the financial aid office is going to look very closely at what's kind of a choice versus what you can't do much about. Medical expenses tend not to have a lot of choice associated with them. Even things like, a fire or a furnace blowing up in the middle of the winter, like those are things that we would want to have people follow up on when we're talking about this scenario C. But discretionary things, and it didn't happen a lot, but like weddings, vacations, the school's not going to be able to take those into account. And I know the financial aid people get those questions. I know that those of you who are dealing with students, your students are probably not the ones that are asking for those sorts of an appeal anyway. If the student has a 0 EFC already, or there are no special circumstances, or the student has cost of attendance expenses that they would like the school to recognize, they can follow up anytime. Okay, so whenever those happen, they can do that. But what I found in my experience is that there's 3 times a year that it's more likely that a school might have some additional money, okay? One tends to be early June. Now this year off on our cycle is a little bit different because May 1 was not the decision day at all schools. It still was for some, but others pushed theirs to June 1. But in a typical year where May 1 is the decision day, what we would find is that in the month of May, we'd see who we offered aid to, who was actually going to come. And we'd also do things like SAP, satisfactory academic progress, reviews and stuff like that. So in early June, sometimes we had more money because, we did all these simulations and tried to do our best guess as to who was going to come and who was still going to be there the next year. But sometimes our best guesses were a little bit off because it was never a perfect science. So early June can be a good time to go back to a school and ask for aid. Similarly, late September, early October, maybe depending on the school schedule, is also another good time. Unfortunately, we know about this concept of summer melt, where students have every intention of going to school, but then maybe when school starts, they don't actually show up on campus, or maybe other times they go for a week and they just are not ready and they withdraw early on. That can happen. So sometimes what schools find is once that dust kind of settles, that they will find that they do have some additional funding as a result. And then last but not least, early January into January sometime, the same sort of thing. Maybe what happened is they probably anticipated who was going to graduate, but they maybe didn't have as good a handle on how many new students were coming from spring. So maybe they set aside money for new spring admits, but they didn't get as many as they thought they were going to. Or again, they lost students because of satisfactory academic progress. They weren't eligible for their aid, or just some students withdrew for a variety of reasons. So anytime you can reach out to the financial aid office, but just my personal experience, those 3 times of year are good times to follow back up just in case and see if more money is available. All right.
Kyla, can I jump in with a question here?
Yes, absolutely.
I think it's one that I've seen in my financial aid office time and that now I still get questions about. And as a side note, I used to work at the University of Southern Maine and we had Maine law, and I once had a student ask for an appeal for an Armani suit for court.
Well, there you go. Okay.
So we've all kind of heard, I think we've all got some stories of
yes,
interesting appeal requests.
Yeah.
I was like, goodwill exists. Here we are. Okay. What do we advise about appeals based on step-parent income, where the step-parent makes a lot of money but does not feel responsible for helping to pay for college?
Oh, people are not going to like my answer for this one.
Yeah, I know. That's why I thought we should talk about it.
Yeah, no, it's, when we're doing financial aid nights and we're talking about the fact that if parents are divorced and the student, lives with their mom, let's say, that their dad's information doesn't have to be on the form. And so they're all happy about that. But then when they realized that once mom got remarried, that stepdad's information was included, that was really frustrating. There is not a lot of flexibility here. So the school cannot use their professional judgment. Again, they have this judgment, but there are some limitations on it. And a limitation is not just because they can't just say, we're just not going to include stepdad's information because stepdad doesn't want to pay anything. That is not going to work. Schools are not going to do an appeal for that reason. Now, I do think that if there's much more going on there, if, you're already on the Fafsa, so they're going to have listed if like there's child support being paid out or things like that, number of people in the family, if some of the stepchildren are living in the household, the Fafsa is going to pick up some of that. If there are other things, again, not beyond just not wanting to pay, but if there are legitimate expenses that impact the ability for the family to pay for school because of maybe some other prior commitments or things that are impacting, then it's worth having that conversation. So just like anything else, if there are things these are things worth having a discussion with the financial aid office about. But I feel very confident that a financial aid office is never going to just say, yeah, we just won't include dad's income because he doesn't want us to. Stepdad's information. It's just.
And I will add here that I would sometimes say, like, we have primary biological parents who don't want to pay either.
Yes, we do. Yes.
So if that becomes, a different conversation, but we can't just exempt the step parent because they're not interested in paying. So that was always how I looked at it, is we have some primary parents. Or just using their information and they can't pay.
Right. I think that's a great point. And I know that's very frustrating to people. And, sometimes what I will say is when, because the student gets caught in the middle, which is why it's so frustrating, and I think it's a very delicate balance. And I don't even know if someone said, Milo, how would you fix this? Because on the one hand, we don't want to let parents off the hook who can afford to pay, as taxpayers, right? But we know that happens and it leaves the student in the middle. But that's the rationale from the from the federal government side of things. If families can pay, theoretically they should be. And we know that doesn't happen sometimes. Okay, so let's talk about the actual process. So going to vary by school. So having the conversation with the school is absolutely the first step. But what you're going to find is that schools sometimes will have a specific appeal form. I find that's particularly the case if they're doing like an appeal because a parent lost a job. And those forms are nice because they will let families know what information they need to be providing. So that's going to be one place where I think you'll find a lot of schools for certain types of appeal will have a form. In other cases or in other scenarios, the school will simply say, just write us a letter and provide the situation. We're going to talk in a moment about a couple of scenarios and what sort of information would be required. But before we even go there, what I do want to say is there's this new tool called Swift Student. I think probably many people have started to hear about it. I've seen a couple of webinars in the last couple of weeks about this, and it's a really cool tool, and it was developed in conjunction with NCAN, National College Access. They're not Access, they're Attainment Network now, and NASFA. So it's really good, and I think financial aid offices are going to find that it works really well. So if a school doesn't have a form, or doesn't have a form that fits the scenario, this website is great because it can help a student walk through their scenarios, and it provides kind of generic text that just helps people get their letters written, or at least gives them a start on it. So I think that's a great thing to check out. I personally, and some financial aid people might not agree with me on this one, I liked to just get a little bit of a summary of the situation, even if I had a form. It just, having a little more context, I found helpful, but that might vary by school. If you are writing a letter, whether it's, solely a letter or it's a letter to accompany a form, some of the things that we want to be sure that families do are summarize their situation and the impact on the family. And sometimes, we want to be careful because, you don't want to tell everyone everything, but it's really impacting on the financial piece of that. So one, occurrence might be, sometimes there's this domino effect that one thing changes and it has all of these other impacts on the family's financial situation. Or it might impact the family in the sense that maybe their family size changes because someone moves in or out. So that's something to keep in mind. We also want to emphasize that the special circumstance was beyond the family's control. So if whatever happened wasn't within the family's control, we want to say that. Now that doesn't mean that if it was in their control, that it's ignored. So, one conversation that we've had a lot over the years is if a student voluntarily leaves their job to go back to school, I personally always thought that was worth doing an appeal for. We wanted to do an appeal for that purpose. But you will find that sometimes, whether it was in your control, a choice or not, will make a difference. Again, we're never going to do an appeal for a wedding. Okay, that's a whole different thing. You want to include documentation. Financial aid is, they're rule followers, and auditors come in and they want to know why you did what you did. So documentation is absolutely going to be critical, but be assured that everything is kept confidential. So any letters, any documentation, this information cannot be shared with anybody. So people can feel free that they can open up about some of these things and not worry about that going places that it shouldn't. Obviously, contact information in case there are questions, and do keep the letter concise. Just kind of get right to the point. It's that balance between providing specifics and you want to provide those data elements. What items have actually changed or what the financial impact of that is, but keep it pretty concise. A page ideally, maybe a page and a half, pushing it to 2, but no more than that definitely, because it's just appeals take a long time as it is, and reading 3- and 4-page letters is just going to slow it down and probably not provide any additional information that couldn't have fit on a page or page and a half. So in the essence of time, I'm not going to go through all of this, but what I just wanted to say, if you want to refer back, and I sent the PDF out to everyone, we talked about a scenario where, you had an income loss in a letter. These are the sorts of things that you would want to say. So even here's some phrasing that we made available if that helps. With income losses, one of the things that schools want to know is it temporary or is it permanent? Like that's a really big deal to a school to have a better sense. Like in this time especially, I've heard the term furloughed versus laid off. That makes a difference. And it really helps the financial aid office, who at this point are trying to help multiple, hundreds, thousands of students get a sense of, what the scenarios are that their individual students are dealing with. And then document. And then same here, if out-of-pocket medical expenses, what happened, what was the medical event, what expenses were there, what was covered by insurance, what wasn't covered by insurance, what's already been paid for, and what maybe is on a budget plan or on a payment plan or something like that. Those are the sorts of things that a school can work with and want to know. And they want those actual bills when at all possible, so that they can put those in the file. And of course, if a medical condition results in a loss of wages, then there's that other piece of information that you want to provide. And as I indicated when I was sharing the scenario earlier about the student who was traveling to Boston, that medical situation, it wasn't really even the medical costs that were the issue so much as the travel, the gas, the food, the housing, and those sorts of things. So just trying to, really think broadly about what the impact is. The reason I'm kind of going through this quickly is because you also have also gotten, when I sent you the email, this new form that we've put together, and this is a two-sided form. And so on the front, we kind of talk about, what we've talked about today, what appeals are, what the steps are to do an appeal. But then on the back have provided some of the most common situations that exist and the language that you would want to use or the information that you would want to provide when writing that letter. So this is brand new. We think we caught all the oopses and the miscues. If we didn't, let us know. Or if this doesn't hit the mark, if there's something missing here, please let us know, okay? Because this tool was developed for you to be able to share with your students. You can give this to your students and your families. You can forward it. As I've said in other presentations, do anything you want with any of our information. You don't need to ask us. Just get it out there. And we hope that it's helpful, and your feedback is much appreciated. So just two more basic things in closing. One is it's really important to work with a financial aid office and to just keep in mind that the financial aid office makes that ultimate decision. So there is no appeal to the Department of Ed, not that I think you'd want to these days anyway, but there is no appeal to anyone else, right? So it's the financial aid office that's going to make that decision. And so the best case scenario is for families just to be really upfront about their situation. And it's hard sometimes to share those personal details, but it's really important to do so. And the other thing is just to keep in mind that even if the school says we can't do anything more right now, you never know. So in my years when I was working with families, there was no doubt there would be families that their scenario, their situation just got to me. And I always kept this little running list of names. So if, I did it in May, but if we didn't have any money in May, but in January we did, I went back to that list. So you always want to have that really good rapport with the financial aid office and let them know that even if they weren't able to do something, that you appreciate it, you appreciate them just hearing you out. And that creates a scenario where if money does become available later, hopefully there's more likelihood that if they've got to find someone to give it to, you might be on their list. And appeals are hard for them too. And they hear, just so many heartbreaking stories. Keep good notes. Make a note of who you talk to, keep a folder. Also ask about response time so that you're not frustrated by the fact that a school isn't going to do an appeal potentially until after they've got all their initial awards out. So you might have sent it in January, but if you know up front that they're not going to deal with it until March, everyone just kind of relaxes a little bit. Where if you don't know that they're not going to deal with it till March and didn't ask when it was going to get done, and they didn't happen to share that it wouldn't be done till March, that gets everyone a little bit antsy. So having that conversation can help. Now we know for next year that everything that's going on with COVID is going to have an impact. So this is just kind of coming back to the foundation, laying the foundation that we talked about at the very beginning. For all of your students who are going to be doing their FAFSAs, the 21-22 FAFSA, starting on October 1st, they're going to use 19 income information when they file their FAFSA. They have to, even though that information in so many cases is no longer going to be reflective of their situation. But they then will follow up with the financial aid office and have this conversation and talk about these things that we've talked about today. So student must do the appeal. And if they need more aid, obviously, if they're good to go, they don't need to worry about it. But if they need more aid, they want to reach out to the financial aid office. Financial aid offices are currently being swamped with appeals, and they are going to be for the next year because of all of this. So, that's again, having the conversation about what's the time frame so that everyone kind of knows what to expect. And as Peggy Crawford, my friends out there who know Peggy, under promise and over deliver. It's a good way to go. And then check with the school, again, when they are going to do the appeal. Can they do it now, depending on when it's taking place, or do they need to wait till the end of the tax year so that they have a better sense of what the income is going to be? They want to, they want to make decisions based on the best information possible. So sometimes they will just say, as we discussed earlier, you just need to hold tight for a little bit, let a little more time pass, get a better handle on what the situation is going to look like going forward. And then last but not least, some of you may have heard that there are emergency funds available through the CARES Act that was passed recently. So even though these funds are great and fabulous, and for any students who are enrolled in college this spring, these can be a really big deal and can be a real lifesaver. But these funds are very targeted. So half of the money, the emergency funding, is going to students, has to go to students, and it's to be used for students' expenses that were related to the disruption of campus operations due to the coronavirus. The law that actually says that in the rules and regulations, or whichever place it's actually listed. So it's explicitly said that funds cannot be used, or it has been explicitly said that funds cannot be used for outstanding balances. So, but I've got a kid who in March owed a bill, these funds cannot be used for that purpose. Also, if I've got a student today whose parent has lost their job and wants to do an appeal, money from this fund cannot be used for this purpose. Instead, money can be used for things like students who were enrolled in say, as of March 13th, and everything went online and they needed to go buy a laptop. Or a student who had to travel home and they hadn't expected to. Or I had a student who, one of their roommates' parents said, "You're coming home," and they stopped paying the rent. So the other students had to pick up the other portion of the rent. Those are some examples of expenses that were directly related to the disruption of campus operations due to the coronavirus. So if you've got students in those situations, please send them to their financial aid office. But when we're talking about our maybe students who are in high school right now, it's going to be a hard case to make that these funds would be something they'd be eligible for. All right, I threw in flowers just because it made me happy, and I just thought we needed some sunshine. I realize it's 2 o'clock, technically it's 2:02, but I will stay on and continue to answer questions. And if you want to stay on with me, that's great, but I will answer ones that Maria thinks that I should. Then we will stop recording, we'll get this posted, and then any that we don't deal with, I will send out in writing. So Maria, are there some that you want to be sure we do?
Yes, we've got 2 I think we definitely want to mention. Okay. The first being that, can we talk a little bit about, so let's say an income appeal has been done and then a student is selected for verification, or how verification might come into play in these scenarios?
Yeah, now I've got to think. Ooh, yeah, so verification may come into play. I would have to go back in and double check. Sometimes when a student hasn't been selected, if the school does an income appeal, it may result in them getting, actually, here's what I'm going to do. Financial aid people on the line here, if you have a chance, just drop me a quick email about what you're seeing currently. So when you do an income appeal and you flag it as a PJ, if a student hasn't been selected, are you seeing that they're coming back selected for verification? Or are they not? Because these are some of the things that have changed over time. So because I haven't been in a financial aid office for a while, I'm not sure what is currently happening. But if some of my financial aid people that I know can just, send me a quick email and say, Milo, this is what's happening when we're doing appeals under these circumstances, I'll summarize that and I'll get that back out to the group. Does that sound like an okay?
Okay. Yeah. Someone said it's not supposed to happen, but it does.
Okay. Okay.
If the school correctly identifies it as a PJ, the student will not be selected. I do think there are some schools that I know I've seen where they will put the student through the verification process first to make sure that they have the correct information first, and then pursue the appeal. So that may be where some of that is coming into play, where they're collecting the same documentation and kind of running the verification process as part of it. So I think that happens probably.
Yeah, my inclination was going to be, and I almost said it, but I just wasn't sure of myself, was that if the flag's there, they won't be. But I just, nothing seems to be 100%, and verification has been such a bugger that I figure probably the person asking the question has seen it happen. So I didn't feel comfortable saying, even if that's the way it's supposed to be, that always happens in reality.
Yeah. And then just a final question, how are the unemployment benefits being viewed as by financial aid offices? Is the additional $600 per week considered income even though it's set to end in June?
My understanding is at the moment, and I will research this because unemployment has changed through the years. I know that, and I did hear the question that I'm not going on a different track, but I know that like money from the CARES Act in terms of emergency funds is not going to be taxable. I am not sure that's the case with unemployment. And I'm leaning towards that I do think it counts, but I want to double check it. So let me research that and I will get that back out to you. We had a period of time in financial aid when half of unemployment benefits counted and half didn't. Sometimes they have counted, sometimes they haven't. So I am not going to answer a question for sure.
Yes,
that I don't
that's
know.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let me get back to you on that one.
Sure.
All right.
And I think that's it, besides follow-up that we want to do afterwards.
Okay, great. Well, I'll get that follow-up done. We'll hope to get this posted sooner rather than later. And yeah, so thank you all so much for being with us today. I hope you found this helpful. I know I went into the weeds a bit, but I hope that you find it helpful going forward to kind of have that information as to what's going to happen once the student talks to the financial aid office. So have a great day, everyone. I hope everyone's staying safe. Blue sky today, that's a good thing. So take care. Let us know at FAME what we can do to help. Okay? Talk to you soon.
Take care, everyone.
Let me stop recording and